Hey friends, good evening. Welcome. I am Dawn Harris, and we're so glad to have you here for another episode of Educators Without Borders, hosted by School Rubric. I am so thrilled to have the honor of hosting today's conversation. So just to tell you a little bit about me, I'm a secondary English language arts educator, gifted educator, associate professor. I'm an author and educational consultant, so I'm really excited about tonight's topic, culture and feedback. This is something that cuts across so many of the roles and hats I wear, so I'm just really, really grateful to be here to share conversation with our friends this evening. So we got some really good feedback from folks who watched last week's panel with Bashan Smith and Lindsay Prendergast, Ken O'Connor and Brad Lotsky. So we're super excited to continue and deepen the conversation with today's panel on developing a culture of learning through effective feedback. We'll cover everything from the nuances of feedback to how culture and feedback are linked, and provide some tips and advice for that, how that's worked for us in our professional context. But before we get too deep in our discussion, I'd love to take a minute and introduce my fellow panelists and colleagues, Tom Schimmer, Julia Reyen, and Natalie Vardabasso. So good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all. I'd love to pass it around to each of you so you can tell everybody a little bit more about yourself and what you do. Tom, you want to get started?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tom Schimmer. I live in Vancouver, BC. I've been in education. This is my 30th year now. 20 years in the school system as a teacher, school administrator, and district level. The last 10 years as a speaker, author, consultant in the area of assessment and grading. And mostly what I do now is what we're doing right now is online training. I just finished a Zoom training 30 minutes ago, and here we are online again. So looking forward to tonight's conversation. Thanks, Don.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Julia, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks so much. Yes, my name is Julia Reyen. I'm a former international middle school principal, and more recently transitioned back to life here in Canada in Toronto, Ontario. And I'm the co-founder of an educational startup called Clear Crossing Academy. We're really focused on delivering future skills-based training to professionals, specifically looking at building leadership, culture, and storytelling.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. Natalie.
Hi. Thanks for having me. First of all, I'm Natalie Vardabasso, and I am based in Calgary, Alberta, where I am the Assessment Instructional Design Lead at a special education independent school that runs from kindergarten through grade 12. And as well, I'm the host of the #EduCrush podcast, which comes out bi-weekly, and hope you can check it out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. We got some really great guests. So a little bit about myself. Beyond the classroom, I work with schools and districts to kind of build out equity teams and bring communities to awareness surrounding equity, anti-racism education with my partner Tracy Browder as we bring the Grit Crew EDU program to schools all over. One of my latest projects is I founded Education Undone, educational consultancy, where I'm actually serving schools, helping teachers to really grow themselves in the area of gifted education, English language arts and literature. So it's been a joy doing that and working with teachers from all across the country. So excited to continue our discussion tonight about culture and feedback, to things that are just vital to our success as educators. So we've got 6 questions that are going to get us through this evening from educators all over the world that are curious about knowing more about how to improve their feedback, their classroom practice. So let's jump into the conversation. We've got our first question coming to us from Ramu, a middle school teacher from Jakarta Intercultural School in Indonesia.
Hi, my name is Ramu Indrasimhan, and I'm a 6th grade social studies teacher at Jakarta Intercultural School. As an educator, I'm aware that quality feedback is a vital component to ensuring your students reach their maximum potential in the classroom. What are some of the main factors that you should consider as an educator when providing feedback to your students? How can you make it most effective? What strategies do you have?
Excellent question from Ramu. Natalie, would you like to chime in on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think when it comes to feedback, as educators, we get a lot of advice about what makes feedback work, especially in the form of catchy infographics or something that's quickly retweetable on Twitter. we hear things like it needs to be timely and specific and actionable. And I think what actually is the most important factors to making feedback work is the things that are not as easy to just tweet about. And I think one of the biggest factors is just that the feedback is understandable to the students. I think that we can sometimes get a little hung up with trying to make our feedback as clear as possible. We're going to tell them what we think, but if it doesn't land with the students, if they don't understand it, then the feedback is going to do very little to drive the learning forward. And there's been some really interesting recent research by John Hattie in his revisiting of the power of feedback, where he actually figured out that students are not understanding the vast majority of the feedback that we're giving them. So it's a little less on what we deliver and it's more about how it's received, I think is a very important factor.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Natalie. That was some really helpful information, an excellent warm-up question to get us started this evening. And we've got a lot more to go. I'm excited to hear some other questions we've got tonight. But before we do, I just want to ask everyone that's watching with us tonight to make sure that you subscribe and follow and like School Rubric so you stay informed and up to date with more great content and conversations from knowledgeable, passionate educators like Tom, Natalie, and Julia. So with that, let's jump right into our next question, which comes to us from Melissa Hayes, a second grade teacher in Hilliard, Ohio.
As a classroom teacher, I'm always thinking about the relationships with my students and the culture I want to create. What are your thoughts on the ways classroom culture can impact feedback? Can you provide any specific examples?
Wow, I really love this question from Melissa. So Julia, I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
I think in building a culture within the classroom, I think we need to ask ourselves a series of preliminary questions. And for me, it starts with acceptance and belonging in the learning environment. To what extent have we tended to the acceptance and belonging of all learners and really teachers as well in educational communities? Then from there, I like to talk about or think about emotional safety. To what extent are our learners emotionally safe in their environment, and to what extent can they express that actually? And then finally, as a teacher or as a leader, how do we model rather our own vulnerability, our ability to take risks, as also our ability to accept failure? And to what extent are our students and our learners aware of this? And I think a good example of this is that a person who really feels like they belong in the classroom and in the learning community feels a sense of safety that they can confidently act on the feedback when provided. So I think that's a really great first step in terms of like an explicit example of how a student might be acting.
Great. Yeah, Julia, thanks for that. Tom, did you want to add to Julia's comments?
I did. I think Julia touched upon something that is crucial in this entire feedback process, and that is the emotional side of feedback. It's Monica Bocarts who talks about how students are constantly assessing both the cognitive and the emotional demands of any task or any activity, and they will choose one of two pathways, one being the growth pathway, and that's where students are seeking out information to help them grow in their competence with whatever the learning is. But the other is the well-being pathway. And that's where students retreat. And that's when they start to protect themselves from feelings of anxiety, protecting themselves from feelings of incompetence. And so they're always sort of making sure that that's in place. It's a constant dialogue. And so being aware that providing feedback, like most things in assessment, is not just a clinical exercise in providing information. It's about the context that surrounds that it's an emotionally supportive environment that supports risk-taking and also just being wrong and being able to have a mindset around correction and seeking growth in my areas of learning, depending on what that learning might be.
Great. Excellent. Thank you for that. I've seen some comments from some of our viewers as well. Thank you for those comments that you've got there. If you have any questions or anything that you'd like to add, go ahead and drop those in the comments, and we can provide you some feedback on those as well. So this is really great conversation. Appreciate all of the helpful advice and comments you've been providing. which takes us to our next question. It's a really great question because it gets at the small details of feedback that really do make a big difference. We've been talking about that some already, but let's listen to Marina Kotala, a middle school teacher from Atlanta, Georgia, with her question.
Hi, my name is Marina, and I'm a former international school vice principal and currently working to serve the students in the Atlanta area. The question I have is about feedback. Sometimes it feels like feedback is oversimplified, yet it seems like things like context, culture, and nuance play a small yet significant role in whether feedback is effective or not. Can you share your thoughts on the nuances of feedback and specific suggestions on things I can focus on in my classroom? Thank you.
Tom, I really like this question. I mean, I think Marina really hits on some important points in our question about what are the things that, maybe we overlook sometimes or that are overshadowed in the feedback process that are really helpful to us getting through to kids and helping them really understand the importance of the feedback and to kind of help them internalize it and to even dissect it and figure out what they're going to do with it when they get it from us.
Yeah. There is a ton to this question, and so I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible because there are a lot of layers to the question. First of all, feedback is simple, but the way I always phrase it is that feedback is both simple and complex. It's simple because over the last 30 years, the research has really pointed us in a most favorable direction, but it's complex because the implementation of that becomes nuanced. Everything in assessment is nuanced and context dependent. Even as we sit here in 2021, there are very few absolutes when it comes to assessment. We always have to consider context and nuance. And so when you're trying to look at some of those nuances, do I have a culture, like have we built a culture of correctness and correction? Have we built a habit of correction? And do we have a habit of using the feedback? So many of us focus on what the structure of our feedback is or what our feedback looks like. And it's not the providing of the feedback that matters most. It's the actually taking action as a result of the feedback that matters more. And so what kind of culture have we created in our classroom that allows students to feel that the feedback is attainable? So example, sometimes we give feedback that is the right feedback, but it's too sophisticated for where the learner is, and therefore it's out of reach. And so something to consider is the feedback I'm providing within reach? Is it at or just slightly above where the learner is? That's not to say students can't aspire to high levels of performance, but sometimes our feedback is too sophisticated. And the reverse is also true. Our feedback can be too pedestrian for where the learner is along their trajectory. So the idea is to make sure our feedback is targeted. And one of the most important things you can do with feedback, and I know this is going to sound oversimplified, but our feedback has to focus on learning. Now you're like, okay, Tom, I get it. Teaching 101, focus on learning. But a lot of the research says that you actually can provide feedback that helps students improve their performance on a task, but it doesn't impact their long-term learning. So you might actually help me do better in the acute moment, but if your feedback isn't focused on that which is transferable, so if I'm assessing the same learning standard several times through several different iterations, your feedback may not transfer with me. I may not take that into the next demonstration, and therefore it helped me in the moment, but it didn't change my long-term learning prospects. So if we focus on the learning and look at the task as the means to an end, the learning is the end, then we've got the opportunity for that transferability. Like I said, there is a ton to get into there, but that's my initial sort of response. And I've got 12 other thoughts, but I want to see if Julia and Natalie want to jump in on this one as well.
I bet they do. I can't imagine. Natalie, what would you like to add?
I think it's something that Julia touched on already. And Jacqueline, I saw in the chat, you said there's something called #fieldworkfails, which I don't know what that is, but I want to check it out. But I think we have to create a culture where we don't get everything right, because feedback thrives on errors. It thrives on mistakes. And if as a teacher, we come in and we are polished and everything is tight and we don't make a single wobble in our entire lesson, a student's not going to want to be exposed as doing something wrong. So a lot of it has to do with how we allow ourselves to not be perfect. And that can be really hard as a teacher because we feel like we want to have everything scripted and planned and scheduled. And sometimes learning happens in those moments in between.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up, Natalie. I mean, I feel like that as a teacher, it's in those times, myself that I grow while I'm trying to, I may have a plan and things don't always go the way that it's planned, or even in the process of giving feedback, and we can all grow from that right alongside our students. So very, very interesting comment. What do you think, Julia?
I'm smiling because sometimes we are our own worst enemies in that regard, in terms of our pursuit of getting as close to perfection as we possibly can. I think that that's a major, I would say, general common fault of many educators is that we do seek a great deal of perfection in our practice. And I think rather than seeking perfection, seeking to better understand the journey and those who we're sharing it with is likely going to go a long way to helping track the feedback as it's, I would say, the continuum of feedback. I'm thinking of in years past, really supporting students through the writing process. That's an intense process where in the workshop, at least, you're meeting on a continual basis, checking in and ensuring not only understanding, but ensuring that students understand their next steps and why those are their next steps. And I'm just thinking, in that case, if we're simply striving for perfection, while the learning's still happening, we're missing an awful lot along the way. And so really humbly approaching those conversations and seeking better to understand not only where the learner's at, but helping the learner to be most curious about what that destination looks like for them.
Yeah. There's so much to feedback is an incredibly sort of complex. There's a lot of X and Y axes to this conversation. But one of the things I often say to teachers is also, don't overthink it. Not every moment of feedback has to be epic. Sometimes all you're after is to cause more learning. All you're after is to essentially, feedback is the second half. We gather information about student learning, and everything students do can be a moment of assessment. It doesn't have to be a tangible. And we just need to turn that information around and cause more learning. And sometimes feedback that comes in the form of a question or a cue or a highlight or a prompt can be just as effective as detailed. So one, don't overthink it. And the other piece is, and this sounds cliche, but focus on quality over quantity. In truth, my experience has shown me that most teachers are guilty of giving students too much feedback. And you always measure too much by its proportion to how much time you're prepared to give kids to act upon the feedback. So if they're not going to get a lot of time to act upon the feedback, then don't overwhelm them with volume. But if you're going to give them some space to really take action, then you can proportion that to the time it takes for them to respond. But much of the time when I'm working with teachers, in schools and departments, I'm noticing that the amount of feedback they're providing to students, it seems like every time they give feedback, they have to create this monumental kind of epic moment. And really what we're trying to do is just cause more learning through our interaction and the relationship that we develop with students.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. And you really hit on that key relationships, because that's really what we're focusing on, even through our feedback, really is helping to, our students to grow in our classrooms through the support that we give them, through the feedback that we give them. And that's where that culture comes in, the culture of learning, bringing the feedback in to help support them through this learning process. So they're really very interrelated. We can see that clearly through the conversation here. And so I think that's where our next question, which is from Richard Siegel. He's a guest editor at School Rubric and middle school English teacher in New Jersey, is particularly meaningful. So let's listen to his question and then talk about it.
Hi, my name is Richard Siegel. I teach 8th grade English in New Jersey, and I'm a guest editor for School Rubric. My question for you is, can you share with me your conceptualization between creating a culture of learning and effective feedback? It seems like this is sort of a chicken and egg situation, and I'd love to know how much other educators are thinking about how one supports the other and some of the developmental stages in creating the culture of feedback and learning with intention.
Great question. Natalie, what do you think?
First of all, I love the idea of a chicken and egg, which is so true. It's hard to know which one comes first because they do feed into each other so much, this culture of learning and effective feedback. That being said, I feel like without really clearly defined learning outcomes from the outset, it's pretty tough to set up effective feedback and any kind of a culture of learning. And I mean, we have our curriculum, we have standards, maybe if you're in the States, but we don't necessarily always unpack those in a way that's clear and understandable for not only the students, but also for ourselves. Like, what exactly am I supposed to get out of this course? And how might we communicate it to our students in a compelling way so that that feedback is valuable, because they want to get to that endpoint, they want to get to that vision. And then at that point, I mean, it really becomes about, and we've said this word a couple of times already, relationships. If you're not taking the time to build that culture of safety and culture of belonging and really strong relationships with your students and for your students between each other, then it's not they're not necessarily going to be able to use that feedback, again, scared of making mistakes, feeling at risk, all of the things we've talked about.
Absolutely. Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. For me, when I heard the question, I sort of thought to myself, a culture of learning is much bigger than just feedback, right? A culture of learning begins with first identifying the learning goals or the outcomes or the standards that we're focused on. It's identifying clear criteria. It's making sure that our focus, and I know this sounds oversimplified, but it really is about focusing on learning, not topic. So the most important part of any standard is not just the topic you are to cover, but what is the cognitive complexity of the standard or the outcome? Like, how deep or how sophisticated is the learning? And it's also part of the bigger picture. So we have criteria. Feedback, of course, is part of the culture of learning. But, again, there's also the instructional responses to that. It's the idea of self-assessment and peer assessment and student investment and agency in all of that. So to me, a culture of learning is a much larger sphere within which feedback is obviously a major part of that. And that comes as a result of the information we either gather tangibly or observe or listen to with students. So to me, it's not really a chicken and egg kind of concept. Culture of learning is much bigger than just feedback, but feedback definitely contributes to that culture of learning.
Great, thank you. Julia, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that, Tom, just as you were describing that, it really clicked with me that we need to be reminded about co-creating this culture with our students and really seeking to understand better from their point of view and their perspective and their lived experience, what is it that they seek to have within their learning culture, within their classroom, within their division and school. And I think in sort of like coming into better understanding with our learners, we might get closer to sort of like chasing after that chicken and egg, perhaps. Again, I think that's a really interesting twist on the perspective. And I really love how that was phrased from the beginning. But yeah, for me, it looks like actually talking to people and really understanding from their point of view what it is that they're after. And for youngsters, like, that conversation obviously looks a little bit different than, of course, for high school students. But I think that we as educators ultimately can really scale up and down depending on, who our audience is in that case.
Yeah, great. I agree, Julia. I think as, being a secondary level educator, the feedback piece, you talk about the chicken and egg, it's more, the give and take. We have to give good, high quality feedback to students that they can apply, but at the same time, they've got to receive it. And really, we have to help them through that culture of learning in the classroom to be able to determine what they're going to do with that feedback themselves and how they apply that and turn that into something new. So great responses. I appreciate all of the wonderful comments from our viewers. Our next question, though, is going to come from Becca Bouchard. She's a junior high humanities teacher from Calgary, Canada.
Hi, I'm Becca Bouchard, a grade 8 humanities teacher in Calgary, Alberta. And my question is, if mandating that students use the feedback that you give them to go and glow up their assignment and hand it back in, build a culture of learning or defeat the purpose?
Great question. Julia.
I love the phrase glow up. I've never used that one before. I'm adding that to my vocabulary. I would say for me, it honestly depends. Pardon me. It honestly depends on the purpose of the feedback and being really explicit about your expectations. Ultimately, if you're working with students on feedback towards mastery of a standard and they're missing something major along the way that that they need to not only be aware of, but that they need to create an action plan around getting to. I think that those expectations are far different than perhaps looser expectations that we might have around guiding a student around plotting out their next steps when it comes to acting on the feedback that we're providing them with, without perhaps the confines of saying, you must use this feedback. And if you don't use this feedback, unfortunately, you can't, achieve a certain standard in this case. And so I think, again, going back to the beginning here, being really explicit about what is the purpose of the feedback and the why behind it. I'm just thinking, like, just personally, I myself have never mandated that specific feedback be used, but I've absolutely encouraged that we think deeply about perhaps why why a piece of feedback was provided, and perhaps helping students understand how it might be applicable if they're perhaps having difficulty plugging it into their next steps along the way. But that's an interesting thought. Another thing that came to my mind is opening up our minds and thinking on a broader spectrum of what it actually might look like for students to apply our feedback. Oftentimes, I think perhaps we're very narrow or tunneled in our position towards this, in terms of we must do A, B, and C in order to impact the next steps, but perhaps being open to what that might really look like in actuality based on who the student is, given where they're at in their learning and where it is that they need to actually be going. And depending on the learner, there might be multiple steps at play, or there might only just be one, but being open to the possibilities of what that actually looks like, I think could take us a long way towards thinking perhaps very fixed about this, and rather than adopting a bit of flexibility.
Great. Thank you very much, Julia. Tom, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I think maybe I'm getting hung up a little bit on the word mandating, because, the providing of the feedback without action is useless and pointless, honestly. I don't know why we would provide it. The whole point of the feedback is the subsequent action. So where I would agree with Becca's question is the notion of mandating from an authoritative perspective. Now, maybe it's just semantics, but if we're going to, especially for younger learners, start to build the habit of correction, that does two things. One, it tells them to expect that there is going to be feedback, that we're not striving for perfection. There is always something to work on, even as adults, and that's the modeling we talked about as well. And then from there, it's the habit of using the feedback, because the exercise is incomplete if we are just providing feedback that students don't act upon. I think, many have said that any feedback we provide students that they don't or can't act upon is essentially useless feedback. This is not an art form where we are providing feedback so the parents can see how hard we work. The whole point of the feedback is to cause action, cause more learning. So I do agree with Becca to a point where it's like a mandate of thou shalt, sort of, but for me, it would be about building that into the natural flow of our instructional routines, that there's kind of a habit that happens organically, that we are just in a position, we are constantly striving along that growth pathway, and we're constantly looking for ways to refine the quality of what we're producing. Then I think it could be a mandate without a mandate. That's kind of the way I look at it. Nat?
Yeah, the word mandate caught my attention too, because I think as soon as a teacher comes in and says you have to do this to improve, to get a better score, to do better on this task, it's what you've talked about, Tom. It just becomes about completing the task and getting the points from the teacher so that you can get the good grade. And nowhere in that equation does the learning really factor into it. And if we really think about each student as being on their own journey, feedback is something that exists out in the real world. It's not something we just do in school as a
Right.
cool teacher strategy. And so if we help them to understand that all of us get feedback all the time, and ultimately we all have the choice to either accept it or reject it. But if I'm really focused on the learning and the goal, I'm going to ultimately make the decision to do what I'm going to do with that feedback. And modeling that for students, I think, is really important for them to see that we can accept or reject, and it's totally our choice, but it's our learning journey.
Yeah, we always are using feedback I use feedback all the time. In the days where we used to travel, I used feedback and reviews on on Google and Yelp to figure out where to eat dinner. I mean, we're constantly using feedback. We get nonverbal feedback. We get feedback in social situations, whether it's nonverbal or paralanguage, things like that. So I think the modeling, I think that's such a great point about teaching the students and showing them and illustrating to them that this is a natural part of learning. This isn't a mandate. This is really a part of what you're doing. Now, of course, there are certain things that are mandated. While the students are on this learning journey, it's not just up to them if they decide they want to learn to read or learn to write cohesively, or there are things that are part of our mandate in schools. But I get the whole notion of just not being this sort of sit down and use my feedback, as opposed to saying, here the tone of that and the atmosphere we create around that can go a long way into helping students see that it's important for them in their own journey, as Natalie pointed out, that this is how I continue to grow as a learner.
Wow, thanks everyone. Really great conversation. It's really becoming clear to see the connection between culture and feedback, the impact that they have on one another, and our ability to provide that feedback, giving the students the opportunity to really grow from it, and we grow ourselves right through that process. So I appreciate all of the amazing comments you've shared with us, but we've got one final question for tonight, and it's a great one to end on. It comes to us from Claire Springer, the Director of Professional Learning at School Rubric, an elementary school administrator in Texas. I'd love everybody to jump in and share on this one. So let's take a listen and then hear from everybody.
Good evening, Educators Without Borders. My name is Claire Springer, and I am coming to you from a very rainy day in Denton, Texas. I'm really interested in learning more about bettering my feedback with my students. Are there any ideas out there, specifically in books, articles, or other resources that you recommend that would speak specifically to feedback in the context of culture? Thank you, and I look forward to your answers.
All right. Julia, you want to share first with us?
Absolutely. One of the things I've actually been investigating a little bit more into myself actually lately is more so the professional side of things for teachers. And I've been looking into something called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And they actually produce a pretty regular blog. And one of the blogs recently caught my attention, called How to Give Humble Feedback. And I think it really ties back to our disposition as educators to how we approach setting the stage and being a participant in the ongoing feedback cycle. And so that sort of helped really nudge my thinking there. And another one that I wanted to point out that isn't actually necessarily specifically directed towards feedback, but it actually inadvertently sort of lands at the intersection is another, it's a book called Building for Everybody by Annie Jean-Baptiste from Google. And she's actually talking about inclusive product design, but the whole premise of her process is seeking feedback from users along the continuum of their journey utilizing the product. And in this case, for us as educators, this is the learning. This is the intended, written, and taught curriculum, and hearing from them what's working and what's not, perhaps along the way, particularly in reaching our learners who require specific supports, regardless of where they're at in their learning, whatever grade they happen to be in whatever system. And so I think for me, those are two ways in which I'm sort of stretching my thinking about feedback and my professional practice, as well as what that looks like for learners in the classroom.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Tom, what about you?
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to two of my colleagues, Mandy Stolitz and Garnet Hillman, who wrote a book called Coaching Your Classroom. And it's a book all about feedback. And they're colleagues of mine. And we co-authored the book, Standards-Based Learning in Action. There's a chapter on feedback in that book. My colleagues, Cassandra Erkins and Nicole Dimich, we wrote a book called Essential Assessment. There's also a chapter there on feedback. But I really want to emphasize, Mandy and Garnet's book is completely focused on feedback. And the thing I love most about Mandy and Garnet's work is that they come at this work from the perspective of a practitioner. So their books are filled with lots of examples and lots of tools and lots of strategies that you can use, in your classroom. Garnet is a full-time consultant now, but was a Spanish teacher and an instructional coach. And Mandy is still a high school math teacher. And it's a really, really practical resource to use. So I want to give them a shout out for that.
Great, thank you. And Natalie, how about you?
Yeah, my resource is less on the practical side and more like Julia in the sense that it's something that's really stretched my thinking around feedback. And it's a book called Thank You for the Feedback, The Art and Science of Receiving Feedback Well. And it's written for an adult audience, but I took some really interesting things away from it that I've applied to how I interact with the students. And one of the big things was this idea of emotional triggers. Whenever we get feedback, even as adults, it triggers something in us because as humans, we really want to be connected to one another and we want to be accepted and we want to be loved. And when we get feedback that feels critical, we can get triggered in a number of ways. And they talk about it being a relationship trigger. So if I'm getting feedback from someone I don't trust, I'm likely to just reject it outright. It could be a truth trigger. Maybe I know something to be true about my work and someone's telling me something counter, and so I'm going to reject it. Or it could be an identity trigger. And I think this is a big thing that Brene Brown talks about a lot, where when we hear something critical about ourselves, whether we're a student, whether we're an adult, we immediately jump to shame. We think, well, I'm a bad person, not my work or what I'm trying to create could be better, but I suck at this. I don't know what I'm doing. And those are really important things to negotiate. And I think it's something we haven't mentioned a ton here, but dialogue is so, so important. And those two authors also wrote a book called Fierce Conversations, which are all about how to communicate your way through conflict. And I think that dialogue is such a huge part of making sure that your feedback is received well in an emotional way.
Terrific. Thank you very much for all those helpful resources and tools. I do believe we have a question that someone has provided in our comments. We could share that from Tamara. Who says, also in DL, the FA cycle is taking much longer, especially if students do not attend live lessons. Would love to hear practical strategies. I'd like to take that.
I can jump in on that. I think I'm going to hope I'm deciphering right. Distance learning and formative assessment are the two acronyms that we're working with. But I think because we are all on online platforms, for me, the biggest shift I made was just to go right to video feedback only. Instead of writing a whole bunch of things out and trying to get that back to students, is recording little short video clips. So Flipgrid is an incredible tool where you can actually now have a screencast and be talking over the students' work while you're giving them verbal feedback. And it might not take that much less time, but in my mind, it felt like much more enjoyable than sitting and writing out pages and pages of feedback or typing out feedback to send to students. But video feedback, I think, is a game changer.
Great. Tom, did you want to add something?
I was going to say that I think, Natalie's point is well taken. I think there are ways in which you can provide feedback and provide it in ways that, whether it's video or whether it's audio, the worry, of course, with video or audio is try not to be too long-winded in what you're saying to the student. But it's, the cycle is the cycle. And certainly with distance learning and certainly with remote learning during COVID, we have to really understand that we've been so schooled on immediate, timely feedback, but sometimes the student's having a little bit more processing time, and sometimes the delay in feedback. There is a case to be made for delayed feedback, and the case to be made for delayed feedback is for students who are sort of toward the upper end of the proficiency levels, where students have the opportunity to be metacognitive. So one thing that you could incorporate is knowing that there is a time lapse. Now, of course, if they didn't attend the live session, that becomes a bit of a problem. But if there's a time delay, one of the things that you could ask for before providing your feedback or your response is to have them go through a reflection or a kind of self-assessment to see where they believe they're learning to be, and activating them through that process. And then when your feedback or your interaction comes, the discrepancy between their judgment about where their work is and your decision about where their demonstration is, that serves as a great source of conversation. That's a conversation starter for you and the students to say, okay, why did you, either, and I'm going to use this succinctly, but why did you overrate or underrate yourself in these areas? Because this is what I noticed. Now, I'm not saying we would use that language, but just the idea that you would notice things about the discrepancy between what you believe to be true about their learning and what their perception is of their learning.
Great. Julia, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting one, and it's extraordinarily timely for what a lot of educators are managing in the learning environment right now. And I'm going to go with attuning and adjusting, like understanding, like, number one, if we have a learner who is perhaps in this case behind and is missing key pieces in order for them to actually demonstrate their learning in an area. Number one, we need to get to the bottom of the why behind that, and perhaps what other supports might need to be in place in order for there to be confidence built up, in order for the actual learning to take place, in order for feedback to even happen. I want to jump back to actually what Natalie said, and about really creating a frictionless process. And what I mean to say by that is that video is a great way for us to reduce the friction when it comes to actually creating a mode for feedback, but understanding what the students' capabilities are on the other end. We have so many of our learners these days that are sort of like sharing devices with their family members, sharing very low or minimal bandwidth in some cases. And so before we sort of like go off the deep end on let's say video feedback, learning a little bit more about what each independent learner actually is working with on their end of the camera, so to speak. But if we are going to go with video feedback rather, another really practical thing that I can add to that in terms of like a tool for your toolkit would be Video Ask from Typeform. It's a great short form way to get that back and forth, to recreate that back and forth conversation between yourself and the learner, which is fantastic. But then again, outside of perhaps being able to communicate via video, really understanding how we can attune and adjust to our learners, because perhaps they just don't have the capability right now, and that's okay too.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you, Julia. Really, really great responses to that question. So thank you all very much. This has been a fantastic conversation tonight, all of you. I know we keep going, but that's all the time that we have. So I just want to say thank you to Tom and Julia and Natalie for spending some time today to share their insights and feedback into tonight's topic of feedback and culture. And to all of you who are out there tonight for tuning in to today's episode of Educators Without Borders, a show where we convene leading voices in education to talk about topics that matter. So remember to hit that like, follow, and subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest and greatest content from School Rubric. And I wish everyone a wonderful week. Thank you again, and we will see you all again very soon. Have a great night, everybody.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you for watching School Rubric's Educators Without Borders. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we highlight voices and perspectives of educational leaders across the globe. To stay in the know with our latest upcoming panels, interviews, tutorials, and more, make sure that you follow us on social media or visit us at schoolrubric.com. Thank you.